1942, somewhere behind high fences and guarded gates in the British countryside. A problem was being argued over in quiet rooms by men who rarely agreed on anything. Maps of occupied Europe lay spread across tables. Railway lines were marked in. Red pencil villages were circled. Checkpoints were numbered. And at the center of every discussion was the same brutal question. How do you remove a man without anyone knowing it happened? Not wound him, not scare him. Remove him completely, silently, and immediately. In the War of Shadows, this was not a philosophical problem. It was a practical one, and lives depended on the answer. Across France, the Low Countries, Norway, and the Balkans, resistance networks were growing. So were German security measures. Sentries guarded bridges. Patrols watched roads. Collaborators identified strangers. A single alert could unravel months of preparation. An operation that relied on speed and silence could be destroyed by one shouted word or the clatter of a falling rifle. Intelligence officers understood something conventional armies often did not. Noise was danger. Sound was exposure. And exposure meant death. The tools available in 1942 were deeply imperfect. Knives were the oldest solution. A blade made no sound when it struck. In the hands of a trained operative, it could kill quickly. British commandos carried the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, designed specifically for close combat. It was narrow, sharp, and optimized for thrusting into vital organs, but it demanded proximity. An operative had to close to arm's length with a sentry who might be armed, alert, and nervous. In darkness, on uneven ground, under stress, even experts made mistakes. A slip, a struggle, or a reflexive shout could doom an entire mission. Other silent methods existed, but each carried its own risks. A wire garrote could be lethal, but only if the attacker approached completely unnoticed. It required strength, precision, and time. A victim might thrash, knock something over, or cry out, before losing consciousness. In controlled training environments, these methods looked effective. In the field, under fear and fatigue, they were unpredictable. Firearms offered distance, but at a cost. Even suppressed pistols were not truly silent. Early suppressor technology relied on trapping expanding gases using rubber or felt components. These reduced the sharp crack of a gunshot, but they did not erase it. In the stillness of a rural night, even a muted report could carry. Worse still, suppressors degraded rapidly. After a few shots, their effectiveness declined sharply. For a resistance fighter operating behind enemy lines, maintenance and replacement were not trivial concerns. Intelligence planners wanted something better. They wanted a weapon that combined silence, distance, and certainty. A tool that could kill instantly from several yards away without producing a sound that would alert anyone nearby. It was a demanding requirement, and many believed it was unrealistic. But desperation has a way of reopening old ideas. In the United States, engineers working for the newly formed Office of Strategic Services began thinking in unconventional directions. If modern technology could not yet produce a truly silent firearm, perhaps the answer lay elsewhere. Long before gunpowder, people had solved the problem of killing quietly. Bows and crossbows had been used for centuries in ambush, assassination, and hunting. They produced no explosive noise. A string snapped, a projectile flew. The rest was silence. The idea was not nostalgia, it was practicality. Crossbows had been feared in medieval Europe precisely because they allowed relatively untrained users to kill armored men at a distance. They were banned by the church at one point for being too effective. If that principle could be adapted using modern materials, perhaps it could meet the needs of modern covert warfare. By late 1942, American researchers had formalized the idea. The OSS issued a requirement for a silent, concealable mechanical weapon capable of killing a sentry at meaningful range. The specifications were ambitious to the point of absurdity. They spoke of velocities approaching those of firearms, rapid reloading, total silence, and compact size. Engineers understood immediately that compromises would be necessary, but they also understood the urgency. This was not a theoretical exercise. Operations were already underway that lacked adequate tools. The project fell under the supervision of a small group of scientists and engineers who operated with minimal oversight. They were encouraged to experiment freely, fail quickly, and report honestly. Traditional crossbow designs were evaluated and discarded almost immediately. Steel prods were heavy and noisy. Wooden limbs were bulky and inconsistent. Fiberglass was still in its infancy. None of these approaches could produce a weapon small enough to be concealed beneath civilian clothing. The breakthrough came when designers abandoned the idea of rigid limbs altogether. Instead, they turned to elastic energy storage, rubber. By arranging dozens of rubber loops in parallel, they could store significant mechanical energy in a compact space. Rubber produced no metallic resonance. It required little lubrication. It could be replaced easily. Most importantly, it was nearly silent in operation. From this concept emerged a compact weapon that barely resembled its medieval ancestors. It had no sweeping limbs, no stock, no recognizable silhouette. Instead, it looked almost like a crude pistol with a box mounted on top. Inside that box were dozens of rubber bands connected to a sliding carriage. When cocked, the bands stretched. When released, they contracted, driving a lightweight bolt forward along a guide channel. The weapon was small, light, and disturbingly effective. Early tests surprised even its designers. At short distances, the bolt penetrated deeply against ballistic gelatin and animal carcasses. It produced wounds that were unquestionably lethal. Accuracy was acceptable within the ranges envisioned for sentry removal. Sound measurements showed that the weapon produced little more than background noise. In controlled conditions, it was quieter than many suppressed pistols. Encouraged, the engineers refined the design. They had adjusted bolt weight, tip geometry, and band tension. Aluminum shafts replaced heavier materials. Broadhead-style tips were selected to maximize tissue damage. The goal was not elegance, it was lethality. As confidence grew, variations were developed. A larger, shoulder-fired version increased power and range. This model used hundreds of rubber loops and required mechanical assistance to cock. It was capable of firing heavier projectiles, farther, even carrying incendiary compounds for sabotage. Another variant focused on minimizing sound even further, sacrificing some power in exchange for extreme stealth. On paper, the program looked promising. The weapons were accurate. They were quiet. They were mechanically simple. But paper did not represent reality. And reality was about to intrude. When the first examples reached British hands for evaluation, they were met with cautious interest. British Special Operations units were no strangers to unconventional weapons. They had weaponized coal, rats, pens, and even food. A silent mechanical launcher did not shock them. But British engineers approached the problem from a different angle. For them, silence alone was not enough. Field testing began under realistic conditions. Volunteers acted as sentries. Targets were placed in environments meant to simulate occupied territory. The results were unsettling. The bolts killed, but not always instantly. A hit to the torso could be fatal, yet allow the victim seconds of movement. Seconds were everything. In those moments, a man could shout, fall against equipment, or fire a weapon reflexively. One evaluator recorded a blunt observation. A man struck by a bolt did not necessarily collapse quietly. He might thrash, he might scream, he might make exactly the kind of noise the weapon was meant to avoid. From an engineering standpoint, the weapon worked. From an operational standpoint, it failed the most important test. The problem was not penetration, it was incapacitation. Firearms, even small caliber ones, delivered shock as well as injury. A bullet to the head or upper spine ended resistance. Instantly, a bolt relied on blood loss and organ damage. Those took time. Time was noise. This realization forced a re-evaluation of the entire concept. A silent weapon that allowed its target to react was worse than a louder weapon that did not. In covert operations, certainty mattered more than theoretical stealth. A single suppressed shot that dropped a sentry instantly was preferable to a perfectly silent strike that allowed chaos to erupt. British designers had already reached this conclusion independently. Their solution was inelegant, awkward, and brutally effective. It was not beautiful, it was not clever, but it worked. While the Americans experimented with elastic-powered launchers, British engineers had been refining a suppressed firearm designed for one task only. It was short, manually operated, and intentionally crude. It sacrificed rate of fire, ergonomics, and appearance for one quality above all others: instant incapacitation with minimal sound. This weapon would go on to define silent killing in occupied Europe, and it would render the mechanical launcher an evolutionary dead end. 1942 was a year of improvisation, not perfection. British engineers working under the Special Operations Executive understood this better than most. They were not trying to build ideal weapons. They were trying to build weapons that worked once, under pressure, in the dark, with no second chances. Their workshops were not factories. They were laboratories of necessity, places where ideas were judged, not by elegance, but by whether an agent came back alive. In that environment, the quiet mechanical launcher arriving from America was interesting, but it was never going to be accepted simply because it was clever. The British approach to silent killing had been shaped by hard lessons learned early in the war. In 1940 and 1941, many operations failed because sentries had time to react. A shout, a whistle, the accidental discharge of a rifle. Any of these could bring reinforcements in seconds. British planners concluded that the only acceptable outcome when eliminating a guard was immediate collapse. No struggle, no movement, no sound beyond what already existed in the environment. Silence, for them, did not mean quiet. It meant absence. This philosophy led them toward a solution that looked almost embarrassingly simple. Instead of reinventing ancient weapons, they focused on controlling the one modern weapon that already guaranteed rapid incapacitation: the pistol. The challenge was not lethality, it was sound, and British engineers believed sound could be managed more reliably than physiology. At Station 9, a secluded development center, disguised as an unremarkable country estate, designers worked on a suppressed firearm unlike anything in standard military service. They stripped the pistol down to its essentials. Automatic operation was discarded. Moving slides made noise. Ejected cases made noise. Mechanical complexity created unpredictable variables. The new weapon would be manually operated, single shot or limited capacity, and optimized for extremely close-range use. The result was a tube-shaped pistol with no external resemblance to a conventional gun. When disassembled, it could pass for a pump, a piece of machinery, or a random mechanical component. This was not an accident. If an agent was captured, plausible deniability mattered. The less a weapon looked like a weapon, the better. Inside, however, the engineering was purposeful. The suppressor surrounded the barrel and used a series of rubber wipes to seal gases behind the projectile. These wipes deformed around the bullet as it passed, trapping the expanding gases that produced sound. The bolt was manually cycled, eliminating the noise of automatic action. Every aspect of the design served one goal: reduce sound without compromising lethality. When fired, the weapon produced a dull, almost unimpressive noise. In many conditions, it was indistinguishable from background sounds. Fired in contact with the target, pressed against clothing or flesh, it was nearly silent. More importantly, the projectile delivered immediate incapacitation. A bullet to the head or upper torso ended resistance instantly. There was no thrashing, no delay, no opportunity for alarm. From an operational standpoint, the difference between this weapon and the mechanical launcher was decisive. Both could kill, only one could guarantee silence in practice. Field trials confirmed what British engineers already suspected. Operatives preferred certainty over novelty. They trusted firearms. They understood how bullets behaved. They knew exactly where to aim. The suppressed pistol did not require learning a new ballistic system or accounting for projectile drop at unusual ranges. It fit into existing training frameworks. That mattered when agents had only weeks, sometimes days, to prepare. Production followed naturally. Unlike the mechanical launcher, which remained a prototype curiosity, the suppressed pistol entered limited manufacturing runs. It was issued selectively, reserved for missions where silence was critical. Resistance fighters were trained in its use. Instructions emphasized discipline: one shot, one target, no unnecessary movement. German intelligence eventually encountered the weapon in the field. Captured examples appeared in reports. Security forces noted wounds inconsistent with standard firearms. There were accounts of sentries found dead with no witnesses, no reports of shots fired, no explanation. This uncertainty had a psychological effect. Guards became jumpy. Patrols doubled. Morale suffered. Fear, when undefined, spreads faster than facts. By contrast, the mechanical launcher left no such trace. There are no verified accounts of its use in occupied Europe. No resistance memoir mentions it. No German reports describe bolt wounds consistent with crossbow attacks. The weapon seems to have died quietly in storage, a victim not of enemy action but of internal evaluation. This does not mean the program was pointless. On the contrary, it demonstrated something crucial about covert warfare. Technical performance does not equal operational success. A weapon can meet every engineering requirement and still fail in the field. The difference lies in human behavior, how people react when injured, how quickly they fall, how much noise they make without intending to. The engineers who built the mechanical launcher solved the problem they were given. They created a quiet, compact, lethal device. What they could not control was biology. Humans do not always die politely. Pain triggers reflexes, shock produces movement. Silence cannot be assumed simply because a weapon is quiet. British designers understood this instinctively. Their work was shaped by observation, not theory. They watched what happened when men were wounded. They listened to the sounds bodies made when they fell. They built weapons around those realities, not around idealized scenarios. After the war, most of these devices disappeared into storage or destruction. Files were sealed. Workshops were dismantled. Engineers returned to civilian life. For decades, the story remained fragmented, reconstructed from surviving documents, scattered prototypes, and the memories of those involved. The mechanical launcher became a footnote, a curiosity occasionally displayed in museums, prompting questions about why such an odd weapon was built. The answer lies not in failure, but in process. Wartime innovation is messy. It explores dead ends as often as breakthroughs. For every weapon that enters service, dozens are abandoned. Each one teaches something. In this case, it taught intelligence services that silence is not measured in decibels alone. It is measured in outcomes. The quietest weapon is useless if it allows chaos. The loudest weapon may be acceptable if it ends the threat instantly. In covert operations, effectiveness is binary. The mission either remains hidden or it does not. There is no partial success. The legacy of the mechanical launcher is therefore indirect. It helped clarify requirements. It forced evaluators to articulate what truly mattered. It demonstrated that ancient solutions, even when modernized, could not always compete with controlled applications of modern technology. The weapon that ultimately terrified German guards was not exotic. It was not clever. It did not look impressive. It was a simple tube with a trigger, carried by men and women who understood exactly when and how to use it. It represented a philosophy of design rooted in realism rather than imagination. Today, surviving examples of experimental weapons sit behind glass, stripped of their original context. They invite speculation and fascination, but their true value lies in what they reveal about decision-making under pressure. They show how intelligence services balanced innovation against reliability, and why some ideas, no matter how intriguing, were left behind. In the end, the problem of silent killing was not solved by resurrecting the past. It was solved by accepting the brutal realities of the present. And that lesson, learned quietly in workshops and testing grounds, shaped covert operations for the rest of the war.